So here we are at the final of the 4 recordings dealing with the Second World War. And up to this point, we've been talking about the war itself, where it came from, reactions in the United States before the Americans are actually involved in the war, and then the process of the war, right? Some of the major turning points and events in the American involvement in the war. Certainly we're focusing on that because it's an American history class, but it is really important to keep in mind that there are other major forces and major players and major things going on during the war that I've touched on just briefly, but haven't really developed in any significant way. So if you're curious about the war in more detail, let me know, and I can certainly point you in the direction of some readings that will sort of deal with those things, those issues. But it's also important to recognize that the war has significant consequences for Americans still at home. So a lot of times when we tend to think of wars in American history, we tend to think of the fighting that's done on the battlefield. And that's only ever a portion of what a war actually means to the American public. Because not everybody in the country is taking up arms and going out and fighting. There are always many, many more people back home who are responsible for continuing the production, the growing, the financial kinds of support that actually make the war possible. And so that's what we're going to look at in this particular section. The American economy grows by leaps and bounds. Manufacturing literally doubles over the course of the war. Agriculture is up more than almost a quarter. Just in terms of a particular industry, shipbuilding in the United States is more than, 40 times larger. So it is a massive, massive kind of transition, right? While some people still debate the impact of the New Deal on finishing or sort of alleviating the Great Depression, the reality is, regardless of how you fall on whether the New Deal achieved that goal, the reality is that World War II was the thing that fully and completely brought the country out of the Great Depression. Government spending just during the period of the war itself was twice as much as all of the money that had been spent in all of American history up to that point. So you're talking about numbers that are colossal when you're talking about World War II. I don't think it's anything that we can really comprehend or equate to something in our own experience because it just has not been replicated. Certainly not in that span of time. And there is a lot of work that's done to try to mobilize the general public to support the war effort in one way or another. Whether it is ride sharing, right? Because all the gasoline that you save by carpooling, basically, is gasoline that can be freed up to be used on the European front or the Pacific theater to power airplanes or ships or jeeps or tanks. Rationing at home to make sure that you are not eating more than your fair share also is going to free up food that can be sent overseas to feed the soldiers and sailors and airmen, doing the work of fighting the war. So there is a lot that's being done to try to ensure that resources are available for the war and that the people on the home front feel that they're contributing in a significant way. There are also changes in American society that grow out of the war or that are kind of accelerated by the war. So I mentioned what's known as the Great Migration, right? The Great Migration is this period in American history from about 1910 or 1915 through about 1950, where African Americans are moving in large numbers out of southern states and into Midwestern, eastern cities, especially industrial areas and urban centers like New York. And they're moving in part, and especially during the war, moving in part to help power the industry in those cities that is needed to help manufacture all of the necessary war materials, whether it's planes or tanks or ships or whatever the case may be. There's also a major move of people into southern states and into western states because those are states that end up benefiting from really significant government contracts to build defense facilities, whether this is parts of the Manhattan Project that are centered in places like Tennessee or New Mexico, whether this is an expanded role by the government in the aeronautics and aviation industry, where corporations are built or expand, especially in western states like California or Oregon or Washington. And a lot of government money then is being pumped into these states, partially because some of those states, population-wise, are fairly uncongested, right? There are large areas of those states that have land that can be devoted to these projects. And in some cases, in instances where secrecy is demanded, these large areas can be kept away from prying eyes. The Tennessee example, if you remember back to the New Deal, I mentioned the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a government project that's designed to not only control flooding along the Tennessee River, but to use the Tennessee River to generate hydroelectric power. This is going to be an essential part of Tennessee being targeted as a state that can build a lot of these defense facilities, defense industries, and that kind of thing. And in southern states in particular, you have a fairly large population of unemployed people that can be immediately put to work in different kinds of industries, different kinds of activities. So lots and lots and lots of things speaking to the movement of people from one part of the country to another. There are also then social changes. And the populations where you see this the most are among African Americans and women. As far as the experience for blacks in America at the time, you see a couple of different important things, and we'll touch back on this when we talk about civil rights as its own topic, probably 2 topics from now or so. So the Americans are fighting a war against, especially in this case, against Adolf Hitler and the really ugly kinds of racial policies that distinguish the Nazi regime. And so Americans, in many cases, but especially African Americans, point out a certain hypocrisy that exists as Americans are fighting to maintain ethnic and racial kinds of freedoms overseas without recognizing the very real limitations and restrictions and oppressions that exist inside the United States itself. And so prominent black leaders organize what's known as the Double V campaign. And the Double V campaign stands for victory at home and abroad. And basically it is making that point that says we are contributing either in industry or at the home front, or in many cases we are fighting on the battlefield to try to achieve freedom for oppressed populations overseas, where when we come home, we will be experiencing prejudice and oppression inside the boundaries of the United States. And yes, there are certainly increasing opportunities for African Americans, whether it's in the workforce or in the military, but there are still a lot of examples of sort of latent racism, and there are certainly examples of sort of less than progressive ideas about race relations. So black soldiers and black sailors are almost entirely segregated in the military, certainly in terms of the units that they serve with, and certainly in terms of anybody that is serving on the front lines. In other cases, African Americans are relegated to service in sort of non-combat situations, whether it's to be clerks or secretaries or cooks or aides and adjutants, right? People who are there just to kind of help staff officers with their daily routine. There is a kind of attempt by Roosevelt to address the issue of race discrimination, but it is sort of half-hearted in some respects. In June of 1941, so shortly after the Lend-Lease Act, but before the United States is actually at war, Roosevelt issues an executive order that says any company that gets a contract from the government to provide materials or services for the military or for government buildings or anything like that, any company that gets that contract has to be desegregated, essentially, right? That you cannot discriminate based on race or ethnicity in any of those kinds of corporations that receive those government contracts. But it's not enforced terribly well. It is, in some respects, an achievement in name only, right? It is a piece of paper that makes this requirement, but there's not a lot of effort, a lot of muscle put behind actually making it happen and guaranteeing that its requirements are enforced by corporations. There are, as I said, a number of African Americans that move around the country trying to follow jobs. In some places, this is going to have an impact on sort of voting demographics going forward. We'll touch on that a little bit when we get into especially the 1960s, when we talk about some of the changes in the electorate. And in some cases, these are populations that will become fairly significant voting blocks, especially in urban centers in northern cities, places like Chicago or Cleveland or Detroit or Pittsburgh or places like that. This is not to suggest that everything is rosy and positive and, you know, people walking down the street arm in arm singing and you know, hugging each other. This is still a very restrictive kind of situation, right? There are restrictions and prejudices in northern states just the same as there are in southern states. It is, I will admit though, somewhat more open and somewhat more opportunities available to African Americans in northern states than are available to them in southern states. But there are moments of tension that blow up into race violence. Detroit sees a really significant riot in 1943, where there are a number of people who are killed or injured, all centered on the question of race changes in population, right? Whites who had been the dominant political and economic bloc in the city for decades and decades suddenly feel that their primacy in those roles is beginning to kind of weaken. And so they will take it out based on the most trivial or, in some cases, even rumors of infractions by blacks in and around their city. So there are improvements, certainly, but there are definitely stains or limitations on just how far that improvement goes. One of the other black marks on America's history at this time is the internment of Japanese Americans or Japanese living in the United States at the time. There's not very much persecution of people of German descent or Italian descent, but there is quite a bit of persecution, prejudice, relocation, internment of Japanese Americans. Some of this was due to the fact that the Japanese were the ones that attacked Pearl Harbor, but this is also the result of some long simmering racism against Asians in the United States, especially in Western states, that dates all the way back into the 1840s in some cases. And the argument went that because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, it was clear that the Japanese were planning even more sabotage, more espionage in the American, either the islands in the Pacific or, worst case scenario, along the coast, the west coast of the United States. And so they needed to be removed. This was designed, or it was excused or justified as being a matter of national security. It is implemented in 1942 and continues throughout the war. And it uses these really absurd counterfactual kinds of arguments, including one argument where the general in charge of this process, a man named John DeWitt, says, well, the fact that nothing along these lines has happened yet, right? There has been no sabotage, there has been no spying and espionage, is proof of the fact that it is about to happen because we know that it will. It just hasn't appeared yet. And so all we can assume is that it just hasn't happened yet. The yet is kind of the essential point here, that the argument is it's just a matter of time because we know that it's going to happen. It's just a question of when. So the removal of Japanese Americans, you're talking about tens of thousands of American citizens in many cases, who were rounded up. Anybody that lived west of that dark line that runs along the border of California and Nevada, that stretches down into Arizona and up into the northwest, anybody that lived west of that line who was of Japanese ancestry would be removed to camps, basically prison camps, in states like Utah or Wyoming or Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, places like that. The treatment certainly was not as bad as camps in the Nazi system, so it's not quite fair to call them concentration camps, but it was certainly a complete violation of their rights as American citizens. It is a complete violation of their rights as human beings, so regardless whether they were officially American citizens or not, there's very little that you can say to justify this kind of treatment of people in a general sense. The Supreme Court, even though this policy was challenged, even during the war, the Supreme Court finds in favor of internment, going along much the same lines as DeWitt's argument that people of Japanese descent represent a threat, an immediate and present and clear threat to the American people, even when they didn't. And so the Supreme Court refuses to overturn this order, this rule, and so internment doesn't stop until the war stops. Somewhat surprisingly, there are a number of Japanese Americans, even people who are interned at these camps, who end up volunteering to serve in the armed forces, and oftentimes they distinguish themselves on the battlefield in the process. So you have race-based kinds of discrimination and race-based kinds of problems, race and ethnicity. You also have gender kinds of changes. And this one may be a little more famous just because the kind of overall narrative of women's history tends to emphasize the importance of World War II on the progress of women's rights. That's a little bit of an exaggeration in some cases. But certainly the reality is that this is going to open some eyes and open some doors for women in the United States that will gradually begin to bear fruit then in the late 1950s and especially into the 60s and 70s. So certainly the most famous symbol regarding women during the war is Rosie the Riveter, right? Rosie the Riveter is this kind of every woman who represents symbolically the fact that millions and millions of women enter the workforce in order to sort of replace the men who have gone into the military and do those jobs. And initially, it is still very much a sort of a gendered approach. Initially, a lot of the jobs that women were given were traditionally sort of women's jobs to begin with, whether this was in secretarial work or in janitorial work or things like that. Gradually, though, women start to find their way onto the factory floors, into the docks, and into places where they're going to be doing more significant kinds of physical labor, contributing directly to building airplanes, or building tanks, or building ships, or the kinds of things that are really going to have a significant direct impact on the ability for the United States to wage the war. And this is going to be the sort of stereotype for how women are impacted by the war. The reality is that at the war's conclusion, as men start to come back into the country, start to be discharged from the armed services, and then find that they need to have jobs, lots of women willingly give up their work, right? There are a lot of women who believed throughout this whole process that this was going to be a temporary sort of stopgap solution. So it's not exactly the case that you see women themselves automatically imagining this as being a watershed moment where they will all of a sudden now break down barriers and step forward into the workforce and claim what's rightfully theirs. There are a lot of women who functioned in otherwise traditionally kind of quote-unquote masculine roles who willingly abandon those roles to allow the men coming back home from overseas to take those jobs again. There are, though, a number of women who advocate that this should be a step in the direction of opening these jobs, opening these kinds of opportunities to women in the future as well. And certainly that's going to be part of this process. And it's that side of things that will definitely play a role moving forward as a certain sort of foundation, I guess you could say, for some of the women's movement that will emerge in the 1960s especially. So what kinds of things then can we say about the aftermath of the war? Well, certainly I mentioned and sort of pointed in the direction of some of these things in terms of race or gender, right? Opening opportunities, changing demographics, changing sort of population centers in the country. Those will all definitely kind of change the alignments of American history then in the 1950s and 1960s and 70s. Things like the baby boom, things like economic changes, changes in societal ideas about women, about African Americans, about civil rights. There are also then certainly significant changes in the global arena. So almost immediately at the end of World War II, we see the beginning of the Cold War. The Cold War is going to be the next topic that we'll get into. Basically, that is the ideological sort of dispute between the United States and the Soviet Union. We see the emergence of the United Nations as an international body that's designed to try to prevent conflicts from erupting by giving countries a forum that they can sort of argue out their differences, settle their differences diplomatically. But there's also the specter then of atomic warfare, right? Nuclear warfare, as the United States is a nuclear monopoly for not quite 5 years after the end of the war. But then before long, you have countries like the Soviet Union or Great Britain or France that begin to develop their own nuclear weapons, which adds to the level of tension, especially when it's connected to those underlying kinds of concerns centered around the Cold War itself. So these are all things that we will get into in the last few weeks of the class. And they're all things that hopefully you can see the threads that tie one to the other, right, as we continue to move forward. So our next topic, as I said, is going to be the Cold War. So it's going to talk about that tension between the quote-unquote ideal capitalist democratic America and the quote-unquote evil communistic godless Soviet Union. And that's going to be then the topic of the next section. Let me know if you've got questions about anything. I hope you're all doing well. Keep up with the full PowerPoints on Blackboard, and I will see everybody shortly.